We also need to talk about a phenomenon we call the black hole in organizations. And I'm going to use myself as an example. Back when I started my first business, when I was 21 or 22, I owned a small business in Canada. I used to employ about 150 people, and I was what we call the authorizing sponsor for most of the changes. Why? Well, I owned the place. In fact, I used to go home on Saturdays and Sundays and think up all sorts of wonderful stuff for my organization. And I'd come back in on Monday morning, and I'd throw my thunderbolt down from the mountain. I'd expect all the targets at the bottom of the organization to change. I'd come out of my office at 5 o'clock next Friday afternoon. What changed? Not much. I was better. I had changed. The rest of the world, not so much. If there's no circuitry built into the organization, when I flick the strategic light at the top, the light could come on at the bottom. Or it could come on at the bottom, once, and never come back on again. Or what used to happen in my organization was, if I flicked the strategic switch at the top, the lights would come on when I watched them. So when I showed up, they were always doing exactly what they were supposed to do. If you don't build any circuitry in here, you get this. Yes, fans, this is the infamous black hole of mid-management. This is where change decisions go and are never heard from again. Or they come out sort of distorted. You can't recognize them. Now, no organizational structural type is immune from the black hole. What do we have to do with this? What we have to do is realize who the executives have the most impact on, and who any manager has the most impact on. And that's their direct reports. So, if we start at the top of the organization with the authorizing sponsor, that means there has to be someone in each successive power structure in the organization who authorizes the change, signs the check, and gets it moving. Their focal point has to be their direct reports. The focus of who they reinforce in sponsorship has to be their direct reports. And their focus has to be their direct reports. So we have an authorizing sponsor at the top of the project or Agile initiative, at the top of the organization, and we have reinforcing sponsors at each individual management layer as we go down the organization. Now, I don't care whether you're striving for compliance or commitment. Sponsorship must be cascaded level by management level down the organization. Skip a level? You automatically create a black hole. Let's say I do a great job with one of these directors on this job, and a poor job with the other one. I'll get whole divisions, whole departments of black holes. Now, when we say sponsorship is the single most important factor in ensuring successful implementation, and that sponsorship is action and position, we're not saying any one sponsor is the single most important factor in ensuring successful implementation. We're saying that this cascading network of sponsors is the single most important factor in ensuring successful implementation. And what, in fact, is being cascaded level by management level? What actions are being cascaded level by management level? Well, you already know the answer to that. It is the cascading network of sponsors expressing, modeling, and reinforcing their commitment, and committing the resources. That is the single greatest determinant for how fast any implementation can go. The building of this sponsor network becomes the single most important factor for any agent of change in trying to structure implementation that will go more quickly. And as we said before, we have to get sponsors to step up and pay the price. Now, sponsors want to pay the least price possible. But based on our previous analogy, they can't drive home for free. There is always a requisite expenditure on the part of sponsors, expressed, modeled, and reinforced. We talked earlier about the reinforcement from sponsors, to reinforcing sponsors, to reinforcing sponsors, to targets. That sponsorship is done both formally and informally on a daily basis. Here's the struggle. If the sponsor's not reinforcing changing, what are they reinforcing? Well, they're reinforcing not changing. But if all the rhetoric, all they're expressed, is change, 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 and all the reinforcement says, stay the same, then you're going to be in pain. Because now we have the rhetoric out of alignment with the reinforcement. And what's going to happen? To the extent of accelerating change, trust is going to go down. Cost of implementation is going to go up. Speed of implementation is going to slow down. And we end up with much slower change. Sponsors will conflict, right? They delegate change. But there are specific things that they cannot give away. The first thing they cannot give away is to establish and communicate the case for action, the business case for action. They may not have to write it, but they have to sign off on it. And they have to be able to communicate it. They can't give that away. And we're talking about sponsors at every level. They have to participate in goal setting. If not the organizational goal setting, then the goal setting for their area in response to that implementation. So sponsors have to sign off on what the goals are and be part of the goal setting for any one implementation. Sponsors have to allocate the resources. Now, the problem with this is, what do you teach your organization? If you dedicate inadequate resources to an implementation, well, you teach people it's not important. So resource allocation is not only part of the criteria for successful sponsorship, but it's also a subset of modeling. We know that the organization determines priorities by where sponsors spend their time and energy, not by where things are put on a list. We need sponsors to constantly concentrate their energies on their direct reports. Yes, they can send messages throughout the organization or run around to find out what's happening, but they have to focus their energy on their direct reports and start and continue the cascading sponsorship. And the critical thing we have to do is they have to outline and apply the reward systems per implementation for their direct reports. Your annual performance system will not work for that. It has to be implementation-specific success measures that result in implementation-specific rewards and consequences for the direct reports. And they have to monitor the progress constantly. That doesn't mean they need to assess the organization every day, but they do have to be plugged into a monitoring system. That gives them an instantaneous picture of how the implementation is going. If we are to focus sponsors' energy where it will have the most impact, if we are not to waste sponsors' currency, then we have to have a picture of where to target their energies to have the maximum impact in the shortest amount of time. These are specific tasks that sponsors can't delegate. Now, on the next slide, you'll see a very simple model that indicates some of the process that will happen with sponsors in the organization. This is a standard change curve that most of you are probably familiar with. And most of you are probably familiar with it in terms of what happens to your organization through the change process. But I think it's infinitely more important for us in this conversation to think about how sponsors react, because sponsors go through this model as well. So let's say your sponsor starts up at confidence, uninformed certainty. They believe in the change, and they think it's going to go well. Well, as the downsides start to hit them, and they get down in the bottom of the trough here, what happens if the sponsor checks out of the change, either overtly or covertly? The change dies. Without the drive of sponsors in the organization, but more importantly for most of us, where does it go to die? Well, it'll crawl into your lap to die. That smell in your office? That's a little project or change you lost your sponsorship for. And what we found out is something pretty simple, folks. Most sponsors don't buy into change. They just rent when it's convenient. And that's insufficient sponsorship. We need sponsorship durability through the whole cycle of this model. In fact, launch is the easy part of sponsorship. The most difficult part of sponsorship is down at the bottom of the trough here. The most difficult part of sponsorship is continuing to drive in the face of resistance, in the face of some of the negative data that's out there in the organization. So we need sponsorship tenacity, durability, and discipline through the whole cycle of the change. We actually measure sponsorship as a competency in organizations. When we're working on major global changes that are worth billions and billions of dollars, sponsorship is not something that can be left up to chance. Sponsorship is a discipline that has to be reinforced, rewarded, and measured in the organization.